Lovely. We should be live. I'll just check that it's actually gone through to YouTube. Perfect, we are live. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to round 5 of NZSDC Nationals 2022. I hope everybody's had a good tournament so far, what I'm sure will be a great round. Without further ado, I'd like to invite up the first speaker of the affirmative team, Ethan, to begin today's debate.
Authoritarianism is the biggest insult to human dignity facing the world today, starting bloody conflicts, oppressing citizens, and exterminating minorities. To prove that we can help the most key stakeholder in this system, the citizens of these authoritarian countries. We believe that under the current system, they're oppressed, they're in major trouble, and they need our help as the liberal world. And so we believe that in this debate, we can prove that A, we can weaken the power of these liberal states to oppress their citizens, B, encourage them to make concessions in improving the lives of their citizens, and C, that by funding these countries, we're funding this immoral behavior that comes at the cost of the human dignity and lives of people by doing things like paying labor. No, thank you. Oh, I'll take POIs in the chat, by the way. We're going to give you 5 reasons why this is true, and then another point about why this is actually good for liberal survival. Point number 1 is that when we trade with liberal countries, only the top 1% reap the money, right? This is because corruption and human rights violations mean that the money that goes to these countries isn't distributed throughout the country, but instead is distributed as much as humanly possible to the top 1%. When we cut funds, we therefore are cutting funds to the dictators and oligarchs that control these countries. This means that they'll have less economic capability to others in the future. This looks like things like warlords buying less tanks and weaponry to hurt whatever countries they're attacking or invading. A massive benefit on our side of the house. Businesses that employ children being shut down because they can't afford to keep their doors open, or because they can't afford to stay open. And so that's our first point. Second point is that we can bring about the replacement of dictatorships with democracy. Because while the economic pyramid and basis that these dictators stand on care not about the dictator themselves, but the dictator as a means to achieve their ends. And when the dictator is cutting into their profits by causing massive billion-dollar cuts in international trade that these oligarchs rely on, I think we're going to start to see these oligarchs kicking out this economic basis that these dictators stand on, getting rid of them and replacing them with a democracy to get more liberalism. And so when we see these elections, when we see these liberal systems being implemented so oligarchs can make their billions, we believe that we're going to see improvements in these countries as the people can actually get a say in what's going on in the world around them. I'll take a POI now.
When a liberal states have no trade, they're more able to boogeyman the liberal world. Why do you support the liberal states being more isolated and in turn more unaccountable to Western?
Well, first off, we'll tell you that they're in many ways, they're no longer less unaccountable to Western influence because of the third reason for this being good for the people involved, which is that when you're interdependent, i.e. dependent on these countries that are unable to behold them to your will, because if they cut trade with you, you're in deep trouble. And so you can't actually speak out about these issues. You can't actually enforce international regulations. You can't actually organize peace deals and stuff like that. And you can't help the people through relief because they've got control over you. So that's the third reason that we brought up. So glad that we could rebut integratedly. And the fourth reason that this is helpful is that even if we're not replacing the dictatorships with democracies for whatever reason, if they can prove that, we can expect concessions like better women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and pulling out of some less important conflicts to the countries at hand. This is because when the people at the top are being hit and hurt by these systems, we can then expect them to become more liberal in the areas that don't matter as much as their profits. Because whenever the billions of dollars being lost is more important to these oligarchs and people at the top and dictators, then they're going to make concessions. No, thank you. They're going to make concessions like improved LGBTQ rights, pulling out of conflicts, etc. This means that we're going to have a more fair and kind and higher and more dignified way of life in these areas, because these concessions will be made that will make measurable improvements, and then there'll be slightly less economic sanctions for countries as these illiberal countries make concessions and become more liberal. Oligarchs take the hit, not the people. We characterize these dictators and oligarchs as giving the people of the country the bare minimum to avoid revolt. If there's a smidgen of profit that they can see, that they can extract, when we're taking cuts out of these countries' profits, this isn't actually hitting the citizens, as the oligarchs are going to take the hit for them to avoid a total revolt and catastrophe. Because if they don't, since they're already providing the bare minimum, if they provide any less, they're very deep trouble. We either see revolution, oligarchs being shut down and dictators being booted out, or oligarchs taking the losses for the people and in general being less able to do all the things that we've characterized in point 1. If even one of these benefits, these massive benefits that we've brought out here, are standing by the end of the debate, millions of oppressed citizens worldwide will be receiving a high quality of living, and that is a massive benefit that should be able to be anything they'll come out with. But I'm not going to only stop there. I'm actually going to explain why in many economic ways, this is actually good for the liberal countries that are engaged in. And I'm going to give you 2 reasons for why this is true. Reason number 1, actually 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is that there's more stable long-term economic outcomes, because we believe, and we can prove, that the liberal nations are deeply unstable. There's risks of popular revolt, reliance on a single industry like oil, and when that industry goes down, the whole country goes down. And they tend to also be engaged in more border conflicts, which means if they get invaded, that's all gone. That means that when these unstable systems are lost, then we get all the cons that they're going to present on their side of the house, but instead of it being a gradual phase out as we become less and less reliant on these countries, it's going to be all at once, and it's going to massively impact the countries at hand. Reason number 2 is that when we see these foreign businesses, they tend to have human rights violations that cause them to undercut prices. And this means that local businesses can't compete with them, with like the cheap oil, etc., which means that we lose industry and we lose jobs. Whereas on our side of the house, in the long term, our industries are strengthened and jobs are gained, as they're no longer reliant on these they're no longer being undercut by these cheaper competitors. And number 3, we're going to see these benefits come because when all liberal countries cut their benefits, we can export to these liberal countries, filling in the gap of the market. And because of these reasons, we believe that A, long-term economic benefits are ensured on our side of the house, and B, we've got this massive point on quality of life for the millions of oppressed people worldwide. And that is why we must win this debate. Thank you.
Can you guys all hear me? Perfect. I'll take POIs in chat, but I might ask for them as well. When affirmative stands for reduction, they stand for less. Less resources, less development, less peace, less social change. This is not a world where we want to live in. On negating, we support the status quo where there are trade relations, where there is interconnection between any states. And we have three independent paths to victory for this debate. Firstly, we can prove that liberal states are worse off on affirmative. Secondly, we can prove that citizens of illiberal states suffer on affirmative. And thirdly, that we uniquely have political change in illiberal states on our side of the House. And we've got 3 points for the House today. I'll be talking about, firstly, why AF's world grievously harms the economies of both liberal and illiberal states. Secondly, why AF's world causes political detriment, and then Hunter's going to split on why strengthening illiberal states makes them less of a military threat. But before I go into that, I've got 2 pieces of rebuttal against the first speaker. The rest will be largely integrated. So firstly, First Affirmative came out and talked about how money is only going to go to the oligarchs. Therefore, like, all these people in these economies are going to be really worse off. Over engagement in the global economy when these ties are cut off from these illiberal states. So on their side of the house, we instead have just unemployment in these industries of trade where money does not go to like anybody, like money doesn't go to any individual. And so we don't see how they can bring about any of their material benefits here, because it looks like it's very much the opposite, where material benefits are very much restricted. But on our side of the house, what we have is money actually mobilizing people to demand social change. More on that later. Secondly, they talked about how oligarchs will turn their dictatorships into democracies when we cut off these ties. Firstly, like, we don't understand how oligarchs would be motivated in any way to reduce their own power, because they fundamentally benefit from there being no democracy in their countries. We tell you instead that when there is no trade, there is no accountability to a global economy, to an interconnected world. And so everything they talk about like making concessions and improving human rights is barely mechanized and like doesn't happen, because on affirmative, like, no one is getting any more power. And like, the people have less bargaining power, because if these oligarchs have cut their jobs, they've cut their security, like, they don't have much ground to stand and protest. More responses to this will also be integrated. Okay, so firstly, why does affirmative's world cause grievous economic harms? 2 reasons for this. Firstly, that states that are decoupling forego this interdependence and therefore forego comparative advantage and lose global economic efficiency of resources. What this means is that like goods can't be cheaper, because instead of maximizing production, we have the opposite. And so when we cut off ties from any nation, from any state, prices rise. And like, because you cannot domestically produce goods as efficiently. And like, alongside this, like, we also lose a diverse source of resources for things you cannot produce domestically, you cannot produce at home. Crucially, what AF forgoes when they cut off these ties is that, like, on our side of the house, we get trade with both liberal and illiberal states. They have less. They can only trade with liberal states because of this moral, like, high ground that they want to stand on. So that means that instead of getting cobalt from both Congo and from Congo and Australia, we have to rely solely on Australia for cobalt. And this incurs like a huge risk, right? Because when a big event happens in Australia, such as like the miners going on strike, suddenly there is no cobalt that you can engage with in the world and still stand for your morals, for your principles. Alternatively, when we also run out of like crucial resources, such as like when America cuts off oil imports like they want on their side of the house from the Middle East, and they can only principally trade with liberal states like Norway, like Canada, especially then if fracking runs out domestically, then this global strangulation of the oil market means that prices go up, and that punishes some of the most vulnerable civilians states who we equally like value on our side of the house, because we say like probably care more about the fact that they can't physically drive their own cars anymore because of these like extortionate oil prices caused by cutting off like the aspects of the global economy than the fact that their state has maintained these like moral virtues. Secondly, under like these grievous economic harms, we tell you that firstly, international trade actually leads to economic development, and development only happens when trade occurs, because we get foreign investors, we get exports, we get we get firms getting to like export their goods on the basis of all that comparative advantage stuff I talked about. And so secondly, what that means is that the quality of life of civilians in these illiberal states increases due to trade. And that's literally billions of people, like billions of people are part of the developing world, and they're benefited because they get, a stable flow of income for producing goods to this global economy. They get to improve their living conditions, they get more disposable income. And we see this in how like Bangladesh used to be literally the poorest country in the world, and now they're one of the richest on the Indian subcontinent. We see this in how China for decades, only decades ago, was a nation of literal peasants, and now they're one of the largest economic powers in the world. Clearly, there have been significant changes for the civilians of these countries. I'll take a point if you have one. No? Okay. So
Saudi Arabia brutally oppresses LGBTQ citizens and women. How would you fix this without using economic pressure?
Well, okay, first of all, on our side of the house, we don't really need to fix anything. We just need to prove that it's going to be significantly worse for these LGBT individuals on your side of the house. Like, we completely agree that these are completely immoral and unethical actions. But what happens in your world is that the Saudi government, now cut off from the rest of the world, now cut off from Western, like Western trade, Western services, loses Western information. And that means they have these little echo chambers where they can literally do whatever they want. I'm going to talk about that very shortly. So why do we have political detriment and to an extent social detriment in AF's world? Firstly, we agree that illiberal states are likely to be more militaristic, but crucially, they are less likely to go to war when they are interconnected. Hunter's going to talk about this a little more later. Conversely, secondly, is that when states are isolated through this lack of trade, they propagate ideologies without any checks. This means that you have like complete control when you're cut off on what comes in, on what soft culture and what hard culture you interact with. You control the narrative of your nation. We see that, for example, like in Cuba, we've had this embargo since the 1960s on trade, and what that essentially meant is that there's been no significant change in how they run their nation, but it has meant that they've boogie-manned the liberal world and they've enforced this echo chamber of ideology, which leads to them more likely to resent the liberal world. They're more likely to repress the civilians of their nations. This only stands on in affirmatives world. And thirdly, trade leads to urbanization, it leads to social development. I already talked about how people get more jobs, they get more money, they get also more bargaining power, because when Western liberal ideas are exposed to civilians through trade, we spark social change. We see this in, for example, how in South Korea, students were exposed to American ideas through the trade of services, through the trade of education in the 60s. They got these liberal ideas, they brought them back to South Korea, they sparked social change. So proud to affirm.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Alyssa, for that excellent speech. Before I invite up Tom to continue the affirmative case, just in terms of recording, some of the other live streams have been dropping out because the internet's really bad up in Auckland. So just as a backup, I'm going to record through Zoom. Can I just check that everybody's still okay with that? Perfect. Oh, I do not have permission to record. I will message the host and then it will start recording partway through your speech, Tom, so hope that's not too distracting.
Recording in progress.
I don't think Neg does enough in this debate to actually disprove the massive change that we can get in this debate through applying pressure to these oligarchs to push these dictators to weaken their ways, through the economic pressure and the fact that there is potential for uprising to occur. I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the capability to get change in these illiberal states. Secondly, specifically what it means for people in these illiberal states. And then thirdly, just the flow and benefits like the Western economies and so forth. Firstly, about getting change in these illiberal states. I want to note that we gave like 4 layers of analysis here as to why we get like change within Western states, about how it forces concessions because of there's like a loss of economic output, how it harms oligarchs, they're forced to apply pressure, how it removes their leverage when they're like challenging like international discourse on these issues. And if anything, it just kills like these sectors, which are very abusive in the fact that they're using like labor to reduce them. We heard 2 kind of responses. The first one was like this whataboutism response, where they just pointed to another example of like how this like brings like harms in other ways. That was never substantiated. Then the second one was that oligarchs like won't like have change as they want to maintain the power. I want to characterize and be clear on what these oligarchs and the people at the top of the society really want in this debate. I think they want 4 things. Firstly, they want to have like they want to maintain like their economic output. Most of the authoritarian leaders within these nations, they have heavy like ties and like cross sections between the economic output of the nation within these sectors and like their own like income. Look to the fact that most of like the oil in like Saudi Arabia is owned by like the crown prince and his family, or the fact that like Russia's like inner circle of oligarchs, they maintain like a lot of like the oil owning. Therefore, they're directly hurt in their wallets, these leaders and oligarchs, and as a consequence of this, they're driven to maintain this profit, therefore applying pressure. Secondly, as a consequence of the rising oligarch pressure, these leaders are literally forced to change their ways because the comparative situation to them, if they do nothing and try and address this dire economic state that is like massively impacting these oligarchs, it can come at like the cost of their life because these oligarchs will attempt assassinations. They will want to remove the like leader and start to liberalize the nation. And this forces like the authoritarian leader to actually reconsider their ways because like their life is something that they really much value. Thirdly, there's just a general increase in like the popular uprising to occur. Because if you buy like side like Nick's material that they talk about how the state of like the economy gets worse from these nations, it tangibly makes these people within these nations more worked up, more willing to push for change. And as a consequence, there is a chance of uprising, which also comes at the cost of these leaders and oligarchs' lives, meaning they want to continue to apply pressure for change to occur. Fourthly and finally, we tell you that most of these leaders and nations have massive egos. They like going to these international conferences like the UN. They lose that at the point in time that they become a parasite and get cut off from this international interconnectedness. That's something that hurts their ego, which they care about a lot. And as a consequence, they are forced to get change. So I think at the end of this, we actually apply pressure on these nations to push for change and uplift these people who are in these terrible situations where they are being oppressed day in, day out. Next, let's talk specifically about what it means for the people on the grounds within these illiberal states. Here, I want to do a bit of work about like, and try and like make out like what actually happens when we like implement these sanctions onto these nations. I'll just say that at a baseline, this is just kind of contingent on none of the material changing about how concessions happen and how these concessions happen. So this is kind of like even if response about better off. I want to note like three kind of things here. Firstly, I think in terms of weighing, we just say that if like the outcomes for the people in the liberal state get slightly worse over a shorter period of time, while they have these sanctions applied, but as an inconsequence there is change occurring with these states, we're more than willing to weigh that off and continue to be in like this dire state. Secondly, we tell you that oligarchs are people generally taking the hits because these are the people that actually control like the means of productions within these nations. These are the people that control like the oil companies within these nations that produce all of this money. Therefore, these oligarchs take the massive hit, and it's not actually like very much attributed to these people within these nations because there's very little redistributive mechanisms to people within these nations because there's no direct benefit in actually like giving these people in these nations money under status quo because they're like just extorting all of their money from natural resources, and therefore these people just receive no money on status quo, so it's kind of symmetric. But thirdly, uniquely, I want to say even if they remain isolationist, it's still going to be way better off for people within these nations now on the grounds that these nations no longer have anyone to trade with as they become isolated. And yes, there may be another nation to trade with, but they're probably also natural resources heavy, meaning that these authoritarian states, if they want to continue to have some degree of economic output and keep like the oligarchs happy and continue to like have a functioning state without uprising, they now need to invest in their people to like boost their domestic economy. It kind of looks like building a service sector so people within their nations can get like good outcomes and be happy with their state of life. I think that's like a massive benefit. So even if you buy all the material about how nothing happens, there's now incentives for them to start investing in their own economy and uplift these people so they do not get annoyed. Right. What do we kind of heard this other thing from them about like development and how like these authoritarian states like, and there's like, when we apply pressure, we can't get development to occur. I thought this was kind of like weird on the grounds that A, it wasn't substantiated that much, but secondly, most like countries and businesses don't actually like invest in like extremely authoritarian states because these authoritarian states are like extremely volatile. Like your whole like business could be uprooted by economic instability. And B, like authoritarian states have a history of like committing hostile takeovers on foreign companies, like turning all the assets of that company into their own. Therefore, it's seen as very risky. Look to the example of like Russia, them taking over the Rosneft company, and literally just gutting it and taking it for their own. But thirdly, I just thought they like pointed to like a single example for this development. And the example they pointed to was like Bangladesh, which isn't an example of an authoritarian state. So I'm unsure why this is unique. Finally, on this idea of ideology that they bring in about like how it propagates negative ideologies, I'm just unsure why we should like care about ideology in this debate insofar as that these people from these nations, they like don't have much connection from the outside world because they're an authoritarian state, but now their quality of life is getting like comparatively worse. And the only people that they can really engage with and put the blame on is the leaders, causing them to apply more pressure. I don't think it worsens ideology. I'll take a PLI now.
Given that these illiberal nations are mostly developing nations, what bargaining powers do the poorest civilians have against the richest?
They have the ability to kind of like throw a revolution, overthrow them, potentially kill them. I think that's a pretty big bargaining chip. Right. Next, let's talk about economics in terms of liberal nations. I think, again, this is like even if, because we believe we can extract concessions from them, cause these nations to liberalize and not actually have to put like sanctions on them to begin with. So I think most of this economic materials, if we don't get these concessions, we brought you three layers of analysis. Firstly, we tell you that liberal states can simply fill the void caused, and we can also get things such as like growing trends in automation to like fill up these like lack of manufacturing that we see from China. Secondly, we told you that we just get generally more economic stability into the long term. And thirdly, we bolster the economic economy from increasing investment in it, as we now no longer want to be reliant on other sources. What do we hear from them in terms of material? There's no direct responses to us, but instead we got some other material about how like prices spike, things become more expensive for people within these nations. I've got four kind of responses. Firstly, we tell you that they can probably fill the vacuum from other nations. They can just simply get these goods from other nations, kind of fill the gap that like is filled up. Secondly, we tell you there's trends towards automation, and therefore like they can just like build robots to take up the trends. Thirdly, we tell you that thirdly, we tell you that most of these nations, such as like the US, sat on massive oil reserves and they don't actually drill it at the moment. So they can simply like begin to engage in their own economy more, drill more of their own oil to fill this critical shortage that is occurring. We tell you that like the example they gave of like how like the US is like reliant on cobalt from Australia, and like and Australia went, tell you that that's like a very small chance of actually happening. We don't see like many substantial harms happening to the economy. Finally, I just want to make a note of weighing in terms of like the economic harms, because we think it's a lot more sizable the benefit we can get to uplift these people from these like authoritarian states out of oppression, as opposed to like having a marginally higher oil price for these people within these nations. So I think at net on weighing, we get a substantial greater quality of living for these people within these nations who have been historically more oppressed. I'm really proud to stand on the side of.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom, for that great speech. I would now like to invite up the second negating speaker, Hunter, to continue his team's case.
let's just have a sense check here in this debate. Why on earth would a deeply illiberal and authoritarian state, a state that is built around maintaining its power and showing its strength, try and bow down to the liberal forces that want to bully it, that want to harm it? We think that is completely ridiculous. These states want to maintain their power. Side affirming is creating states that are pariah states, that are not engaged in the global community, stand with side negating a side that wants more accountability, more connection, and overall more long-term change. What am I going to do in my speech here today? 3 things. Firstly, prove to you why we get better political outcomes on our side. Secondly, why our economic outcomes are also better on our side. And then thirdly, I'm going to split on why strengthening illiberal states makes them less of a military threat on our side. Okay, firstly, let's talk about political outcomes then. And notice that if we win or we prove that political outcomes are worse on affirming side, we win this debate immediately because they've thrusted their entire case around this premise. Let's start with political outcomes. They firstly push a lot of things like LGBT rights, women rights, and all of this stuff, etc. We tell you that stuff is actually much better on our side because these changes come with social development and social change and perspectives, right? And when you're in a state that is very isolated, you aren't trading with anyone and you don't have much connection with the outside world and you're very poor, you likely don't understand like many different global perspectives, especially if you're in a position of power, a position of influence. You don't understand how the other world views things in more liberal ways. I'll walk you through on our side why it's much better, because we tell you that when you are like a developing state and you are trading with another country, you might get things like their media and their music coming through, which might push some of those liberal ideas, liberal concepts on you. Or maybe in another way, you're trading through them through services. And when those people go to like American universities or British universities to go study, and they come back and they learn those ideas and they push those social like concepts on those people in the long term. An authoritarian state is not suddenly just going to get cut off from the world and saying, all right, let's legalize gay marriage, let's improve women's rights, let's just do all of these massive societal changes when we've already got a massive amount of economic detriment now because we've got no trade. We tell you that social change is better on our side when it happens naturally. That first speaker gave you examples of South Korea, that still stands. They secondly then tell you stuff about revolution. This is completely ridiculous. Why is a state going, like, why is a country that is incredibly poor, incredibly unurbanized, and has pretty much no military access going to easily be able to start a revolution? Where are they going to get these weapons from and all these resources to start a revolution? It's completely ridiculous. All you're going to get is probably like some peasant uprising, which just gets immediately crushed. They don't get any of their stuff. They then wanted to bring a mechanism about how oligarchs are going to want to push for the social change, and we'll use them as a mechanism to get political change. All right. Firstly, like side affirming is kind of just sitting in Russia now because that's pretty much one of the only liberal states where oligarchs are like have a significant power. But even if you take the idea that oligarchs are present in like all of these illiberal or authoritarian states, oligarchs aren't going to pressure a government which has complete control of military power and could easily kick them out and gut them like they even told us that they would. What these oligarchs are going to do is what they did in Russia when Russia got sanctioned. They moved to somewhere like Georgia and they keep their own economic output, they keep their own economic wealth because they care about themselves, like society affirming wanted to tell us. So we tell you that it's completely ridiculous to think that oligarchs are suddenly going to want to push for things like democracy and liberalism, which immediately harms both their own economic wealth and economic prosperity and harms their own power in a state which is deeply illiberal by sacrificing themselves to democratic forces. That is a completely ridiculous take from side affirming. So since we've proven to you that you're not going to get any political change and that it's actually better on our side, we're already beating side affirming on that thrust there. But let's talk about economic outcomes then and why we are winning. Firstly, we brought you material about things like employment and the loss of jobs. Side affirming wants to push things like human rights violations and stuff like that. We tell you that in these countries, when people are choosing those jobs, over choosing things like working in like rice fields, for example, or working in rural areas, that is a sign of their own revealed preference. They are choosing to go into those jobs. They're choosing to choose them over things like farms. We tell you that what you get on side affirming side instead is you cut off all of this trade. It means that somewhere that is like a liberal, that is like whatever side affirming's definition of a liberal is, and then tell us one. But we tell you that like when that cutoff happens, you lose all that employment and you lose all of those jobs. And clearly that's bad on these people that they want to stand for because they chose to have those jobs in the first place. They clearly valued that over whatever thing that side they care about. Secondly, they tell us that these countries can easily self-develop if we tell that for two reasons. One, development normally comes things like all of the resources necessary to immediately develop their economy. We tell you get that development through trade, through foreign investment. Don't invest in developing countries is completely ridiculous. We see in liberal countries is completely ridiculous. We see people invest in Saudi Arabia for oil. They invest in parts of Africa for natural resources. They invest in the Indian continent for things like clothing. Completely ridiculous take by side firming on that. And secondly, we tell you that when you're isolated from the world, you just get a case like Cuba. You boogeyman the West, you boogeyman America and saying that they want to bully you, they want to keep us poor. We need to stay in government because the liberal world doesn't want to see you thrive. That's why they're punishing us right now. You don't get any change. They're able to lock themselves in. Okay. They also finally said that you can just easily fill the void for like liberal countries and that you can't trade with Bangladesh now, you just find someone else to do that. If it was so easy to fill the void, why haven't we done that anyway? Like, that's completely ridiculous. If it's cheaper and it's easy to do it elsewhere with a liberal country, why haven't we done it? Come on, side affirming. Okay. I'm now going to move into material then about why strengthening liberal states makes them less a military threat, but I'll take your point.
In our worst case, where these nations become isolationist and now can no longer export any of their products due to the lack of economic interaction to invest in their domestic economy and create jobs for their people.
Well, where are they going to get that investment and money from? Because they can't trade with anyone because you've locked them out, like you just said. Okay, let's talk about strengthening a liberal state then. Okay, 2 reasons why when you trade, these countries are going to be less militaristically dangerous. Okay, 1, states are going to be more aggressive when they are weak and insecure. That is why a country like Iraq was invaded places like Kuwait and Iran, and why Saudi Arabia has not invaded anywhere. Both of these states are liberal, both are authoritarian. Why is this the case? 2 reasons. 1, you want to deflect your own failures as a country on someone else. You want to say, it's not our fault in the Iraqi government why you're poor. It's actually the people in Kuwait or the Persians that is your reason. We need to deflect our hate on them. They actually get worse on things like minorities, because now these states can blame that there's someone that's thieving against us and they're making us economically bad, like we saw in the Jewish people, for example. Secondly, we tell you that when you're rich and economically developed, resources are no longer that much of a concern to invade other countries. If you don't need, we tell you when you're developed, things like technology means that if you're a country like China, you're not going to invade Taiwan because of semiconductors, for example. And secondly, we tell you that when you are actually trading, sanctions become more powerful because your country is hooked on things like iPhones and Coca-Cola, rather than they have no conception of it. Because we're the side that leads to better political and economic outcomes, stand by of fading.
Can you guys just hear me? Because that previous speech was a bit laggy. So can I be heard fine?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. I think Side F lost this debate the second they came out and they said they have basically no comparative on how they're going to solve the outrageous human rights violations that are being perpetrated in these illiberal states. 3 parts of the speech. Firstly, I'm going to be explaining why stopping bad practices is the most important thing in this debate, and why on our side of the house, we have the sole mechanism to do that through creating economic accountability for these states, which is what actually engineers change. They have no other mechanism for engineering change. Then I'm going to be talking about the 2 points of clash, which is benefits to citizens in these countries, and then the economies of liberal states. Okay. Why is stopping bad practices the most important thing? Firstly, we see tangible harms, e.g. slave labor, or e.g. like terrible women's like rights or LGBTQ rights violations happening in countries like Saudi Arabia. And secondly, we tell you that the people running these countries generally are bad people who we don't endorse in any capacity. And by stopping these bad practices, we deplatform them, or at our worst, we like force them to change into the global economy. Long term, the economic points are like largely symmetrical since trade resumes, and they're arguably better since unsustainable practices like slave labor or undemocratic nations are gone. So when we win the like stopping bad practices point, we win the economics point by default. Okay, I'll take a POI quickly if you have one.
And in a liberal state is not trading, there are less like outside forces which can influence them economically and politically. Why would a liberal actor want to like reduce their own power and influence when they already have more control without trade?
Well, you say there's no influences acting on them, but I tell you that when you're like restricting all their trade, when you're stopping like food and like Western goods coming into Saudi Arabia, that is an outside actor influencing on them, and you've like completely missed that analysis through your entire case. That is an outside actor. We exclusively have outside actors influencing in this case. Okay, now first point of clash, engineering change. Okay, I think we bring you several lines of analysis. Most crucially, we've told you that like these countries on a whole are like highly reliant on like one good, I.E oil. As such, they are highly reliant on Western nations who bring like more refined goods like iPhones or whatever to them. They need these to survive in it. And then thirdly, we've told you they harm oligarchs, sets examples to other countries, remove leverages, and generally just encourages change to reintegrate. We see several lines of response from AF on this. Firstly, they tell us about accountability. We tell you at best this is like symmetric. They've provided no alternative accountability mechanisms other than like they still get to trade, they still get all the benefits involved in like liberal world as a whole, but they get like none of the responsibility, which is like basic human decency and basic principles. And thirdly, we tell you that the actual accountability mechanisms we are offering is like removing these people from the world, removing their power to trade, removing their economic basis for these rulers. That is accountability, that engineers change. Then thirdly, they bring us this point about trade of ideas. We tell you that like Saudi Arabia is not having like someone from the LGBTQ community come in and share their ideas. They don't get shared ideas on their side house. What we get in our side house is an opportunity to these leaders to reflect on what they're doing wrong, reflect on their human rights atrocities, and adjust accordingly to be reintegrated into the global economy. Yeah, and then they told us that like they actually have leverage from the workers or whatever on their side house since they're getting money. A worker getting slave labor in a Chinese like sweatshop does not have any more leverage than the Western countries do when they are oppressing the other countries. Yeah, so I think generally all their analysis misses the mark since they don't actually engage with any of our mechanisms about how we apply financial pressure to these countries and how like these like oil oligarchs, they have no one to trade with since all these like a lot of these like oil majority countries, they all engage in similarly bad practices. They're all cut off. They have no one to trade with. Their finances are ruined. I'll take your POI. Oh, you're on mute. I'll just skip your POI then. Okay.
If no one is coming in spreading liberal ideas, even with trade already, how are these ideas then going to spread when you make these nations even more cut off?
Why? I think it's pretty obvious why, because they're going to be seeing that they're going to be told they're being cut off because they're oppressing human rights. They're like stoning people for having like different sexual orientation, all these terrible things. They're considering this and they're changing it. On your side of the house, you just get an echo chamber because they get all the rewards of engaging in good practice, none of the benefits. Okay, let's look at their stuff about engineering change. They told us about development in these countries. We tell you that the oligarchs control the money so it doesn't get back to the people. And in the case it is actually reinvested in the country, it goes into the same industries, such as oil or whatever, so these people stay in power. Then they told us that the citizens are one stuff affected. Let's look at harms to a liberal state's citizens. We tell you that the people harm to oligarchs because of these corrupt financial systems. They bring the money to the oligarchs. Oligarchs are the one primarily being harmed. And then secondly, we told you that like at our very worst case, this means we buy all their material about how like nothing happens to engineered change. We still get better stuff since these people are now investing into the economy. So instead of them working slave labor in like a Chinese sweatshop, they've now actually established like some level of domestic economy instead of just outside trade of oil or whatever. And I think just generally weighing up harms, countries engaging in practices such as slave labor or like egregious women's rights abuses, it's far worse net harm than like the everyday citizens having a slight reduction to incoming goods. Okay, and then let's move on to, and then they told us like their only response here was like, where does this money come from? This money comes from like these oil oligarchs. Instead of like spending it on developing oil, they're now spending it on developing the domestic economy or whatever. Now onto this military point. First, it's a direct contention with their response to the uprising material. And then secondly, with no trade, they can't buy like Western military equipment such as fighter jets to have a capable military. So I think based on that, we clearly hit on engineering change. And since we're hit on engineering change, we went on the economics point by default, since we don't have long-term economic impacts to these like liberal nations at the point in time where engineering change and reintegrating these people in these countries back into the liberal economy. Okay, now into the liberal states economy. I think they never really engaged with any of our material about how it like strengthens the domestic economy and like how these nations are like economically unstable and generally a bad bet to hedge them on, and like how it creates a void where trade is fulfilled. I think their only responses here were about like prices rising or whatever. I think there's just going to be like a basic sense of cooperation or whatever. And like there's stuff about cobalt factories being destroyed as like a, really that's a big leap of logic and really a, like just a massive like very low chance of occurring. And they said, why hasn't it been done already? It hasn't been done because it's slightly more expensive since these liberal countries aren't having slave labor to produce their goods. Okay, so I think weighing it up, we clearly win the engineering change point since we actually suggest a mechanism to engineer change, financial like pressure, which hasn't been engaged with by a single one of our speakers, all the impacts, single one of their speakers, all the impacts they're saying. And I've already explained why we win the economy point by default, because we win that first point.
Sorry. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. There is a massive flaw in the case we've heard from AF as soon as they hang their hat on somehow that the prospect of not getting gains from trade will incentivize massive internal social change, and thus all the wrongs of illiberal states will be washed. What we say on our side is that economic change must come first, and economic change is the prerequisite of any political change. 2 main points of clash for you today. 1, on which side gets the best economic change overall, and 2, on which side gets the best political change in the illiberal states. Firstly, on economic change. What they've said here is implicitly that if these illiberal states change, they're allowed into the world of trade and they gain from that. Thus, there's economic gains, all contingent, by the way, on a political change happening internally. We have no such contingency in our case. These are 2 very, very independent points, 2 very, very independent paths to victory in this debate. So firstly, on why the non-illiberal states
would be harmed by decreasing trade. Simply, it's really easy. Comparative advantage and a diversity of sources of stuff. If you're an American, you buy your clothing from Bangladesh, which they tried to say wasn't an authoritarian state. Tell that to Sheikh Hasina. She might be insulted that you doubt her authority. Now, what's important here is that you fundamentally cannot get this stuff as cheap from elsewhere. That's why it's there, as Hunter so eloquently pointed out. If we can get it elsewhere for the same price, why don't we? If we really care about human rights stuff, obviously, if we care about human rights as consumers and as people in the West, then the only reason we'd still trade with these people is if we had to, right? Therefore, it's obvious that we need this. We need them for our cheap goods and for oil. If America, although they are now truly energy independent. Fracking is not a long-term answer. Fracking will run out. Saudi Arabia's oil will not run out in the same time frame. It will last a lot longer. And if there is a fracking crisis in the United States, they will fall back on Saudi oil. Crucially, as we said from first, we can get it from anyone, from Norway, from Canada, but also from Saudi Arabia. There's simply more security. This is a massive impact, as we've seen with the massive inflation currently happening as the system of global trade has fallen apart and the massive upheaval this will cause inside of these states. It is likely that if there is a red wave in these midterms in the United States, that is due in no small part because of inflation, because of disruptions to global trade. This system is invaluable and cannot be violated. Now, as we come to the illiberal states themselves, fundamentally what they've said is they can just invest internally. Obviously, they cannot do this. One, foreign trade is needed for foreign exchange. Why would you make goods? Why would you invest in a factory if you didn't have a market for that? China made automobiles before Chinese people bought automobiles, but it built the automotive industry in China that then served the internal market. That is how this process works. You build something for an external market, and then as your people get richer, they then buy from this industry that you've constructed. The other reason here is resource access. If you don't buy a certain resource that maybe only comes from a very small amount of places, like if you as a country have to buy chips, but the only high quality chips come from countries which won't allow you to interact, how will you build your own industry? What technological exchange can happen? It cannot happen, is the simple point. FDI as well is very important. Where are you getting all this money to build all of these factories? They're saying that, oh, the oligarchs will just, instead of investing in oil, they'll invest internally. With what money if they're not selling the oil, right? Like what possible income, what net income can there be? You can't create money out of thin air. You have to have resources to invest. We are the only side that gets this. This is by far the biggest impact in this debate. This is the lives of billions of people. This is 800 million people in China lifted out of absolute poverty, out of under $1.50 a day. This is the biggest impact, I think, we can ever claim in any debate. This is the rise of the Chinese middle class of 300 million people who now have immense spending power and immense power to improve their own lives. They have said that these jobs are exploitative and thus we should abolish them. No, people have chosen them. They obviously think it's better than the alternative. Stand behind 1 billion people being better off in our world that they cannot give you in their world. So secondly, why does political change only happen in our side? So firstly, they've hanged their hat on the oligarchs because they want money, will encourage change when you threaten their livelihoods. There are a bunch of responses here, and note all this is internal change. I have a separate point on external actions and why they are more bad actors when they're isolated. So internally, oligarchs. One, oligarchic systems are not common. That is not how most of these systems are run. Egypt is not run by oligarchs. Pakistan is not run by oligarchs. They're run by the army. Somalia is run by warlords. China is run by the Communist Party. It is not as if behind every leader there's an oligarch with business interests. No, hard power and having guns matters a lot more than money as an oligarch in these illiberal systems. So one, that oligarch example does not work for the vast majority of instances. Two, oligarchs can just live. Oligarchs often often have most of their money held externally anyway. And like as an oligarch, are you really more invested in doing the hard yards to improve what your country is like when you could just leave? You know, it doesn't really work out like that. Oligarchs also, they value power, right? Insofar as they say that you can build an economy internally, surely the oligarchs are also in charge of that economy. So even if they're isolated, they're still in charge. And surely what they fear most actually is competition from outside, because they can control their own interests inside of the state. So when you integrate them, the power of the oligarchs actually falls. Now, also, oligarchs, their ideas are oligarchs will advocate for like good social causes, for LGBT rights and stuff, right? All it takes is for isolated, all it takes is one fundamentalist Islamist coup, as happened in Iran, and they just shoot the 100 or so oligarchs who are in charge of all these causes, right? Like, it is absurd thinking that these economic interests are really that strong in these places. I'll have a point of information if you have one. A bit late, but sorry.
Who do we have a greater moral duty to? People living on slave wages or a middle-class American?
If you choose this, if you've chosen the slave wages, that means that you've obviously said it's better than your alternative of being on a farm, right? That's your choice. You're free to make that choice. And if you want to act in your own best interest, we stand behind them. We stand behind a billion people lifting themselves out of poverty through back-breaking hard work in sweatshops. We stand behind that on the affirmative side. So finally, on external actors, we've seen no response whatsoever on the simple fact that interdependence in economics means that countries do not go to war. Places do not invade other places when they are economically intertwined with that, because there's a fear of losing that in the war. So simply at the end of this point, we are the only side which guarantees the economic advancement of billions of people, and we are the only side that through this economic advancement constructs a middle class able to advocate for social change. Stand behind side F. I think.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that great speech. I'd now like to reverse the speaking order and invite back up the negating leader to give their reply speech.
Okay.
The world that side affirming lives in is a world of contradictions. They tell us that trade is an incentive because it means you have no money. But then they tell us that oligarchs and developing illiberal countries can easily invest in those countries. They have the money to do so. Side affirming doesn't know where they stand in this debate. Stand with side negating that wants long-term social and political change and better economic outcomes for the wider world. I'm going to walk you through our path to victory, firstly proving why F can't win on their burden of getting societal and political change, and then why we extend our margin of victory through economic, political, and militaristic outcomes. Let's start off with then about how F has tried to tell us how they engineered change. Put simply, F tells us that if you have no trade, oligarchs and the people will want to have to reduce and reflect on their human rights abuses because they're not getting any money that's coming into their country. They then tell us on third and through second as well, that these countries will also now have the money and the incentive to economically develop their own countries, to create their own little economy domestically within that country, to then improve all of those human rights and improve all of those things that they want to tell us. Notice that there is a tension with one another, because if countries can easily just develop their own country internally, why is trade an incentive anyway? All we think is going to happen if you take side of affirming's material is they're just going to be more isolated, develop themselves independently, and still kill LGBT people, still kill women and stone people to death, just like side affirming wants to tell us is going to happen. We tell you you get no political change on their side. Why do we do it better? Because we tell you for two reasons. One, we have the spreading of liberal ideas. We told you about things like education. You're getting exposed to new liberal ideas, Western concepts, etc., which in turn mean you're likely to spread that as an oligarch or spread that as a person within society. You lead to that long-term social change. We also brought you material about economic development, how the expansion of the middle class means that people are going to want some more civil liberties to be enacted by that government because they have more bargaining power in their wealth. They're more urbanized and more collected as a people. They're more able to bargain for those things. We didn't hear any response from side affirming on that material, it still stands. We brought you plenty of stuff about how countries are able to boogeyman people who they don't like. They can boogeyman the LGBT community. They can boogeyman women. They can boogeyman whoever side affirming wants to stand with when they're locked up and say that these are the enemies. We need to continually punish them. We also brought you material about how oligarchs are not going to be the right mechanism for side affirming to actually lead to change, because oligarchs care more about their own wealth than actually the wealth of their country. So they can easily just dodge it like they did in Russia and move to Georgia, or move to another country and easily dodge it with their own internationally held wealth. They're more likely to care about holding their own power rather than sacrificing it all for this democratic greater good that side affirming thinks they're suddenly going to want to push. Let's talk then about why we win and extend our margin of victory on economic outcomes. Firstly, they want to push all this material on us about how these jobs are abusive. As I told you down the line, clearly people are choosing to take those jobs over the alternative. We think if that leads to better employment and better income for those people in a liberal states, that is a good outcome. We then told you that it's better for liberal states because they get no diversity of trade. We had two lines of analysis from side affirming on this case. One, that they can fill the void, completely ridiculous. Otherwise, we would have already been trading with these liberal countries if you could easily just fill the void like that. And then on third, they just said, oh, we'll just cooperate together. What? So we're all just going to sell oil to each other at a loss, just so we get some better outcome for this principle of liberalism and stuff like that. Stuff is more expensive in these illiberal countries that harms vulnerable people like the middle class, like the lower class within developed countries. That's something to stand for. We also heard no response about how these illiberal countries are less likely to go to war. That material still stands in this debate. Stand with the side of the people, stand with the side of both the liberal and illiberal countries, stand with side negating.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that great reply. I'd now like to invite up the reply speaker of the affirmative team to conclude today's debate.
I think when it comes to the capability of change, Neg only provided two ways to do this. Firstly, they talked about this vague notion of social change, which wasn't really substantiated or explained. Then secondly, they talked about the economic leverage of civilians, which literally came out at leaders' reply. They never had any of it from first, from second, from third, really explaining how they apply pressure for this change to occur in this debate. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, about the capability of change, and then secondly, just the broader economic points for liberal nations. Firstly, for the capability for change. I just want to clear up this stuff about the isolationist material and make clear that it is not a contention insofar as that was our worst case. We're saying even if you can prove that this doesn't happen, we are still substantially better off. I think they need to realize that. And further to that, let's say it does happen, we still believe it is preferable than what happened before, right? Let's look at our exact analysis as to why we force concessions for change and cause these states to liberalize. Firstly, we told you that it cuts into the wallets of leaders who own the industry and they lose their ability to spend. We heard no response to that. Secondly, we told you that there is the capability for revolution to occur, and we said, and the response we got to this about was that these these nations have big militaries. Luke pointed out that if they're no longer engaging in trade, they cannot fuel their military, and therefore it's very hard for them to quash this ascent. And presumably, the military as well is going to want to be working against, because they're subjective cost of living is worse, and because they're also civilians, and this analysis implies. And we also told you about it harms the egos of leaders. No response to that. Then the fourth one, which we heard the most engagement with, was how it increases the pressure of the oligarchs onto the leader. I think I would note just two things here. Firstly, we just simply say that oligarchs are driven by profit above all else. And insofar as that they don't really care who's in charge, as long as they can substantiate their profit. This is what we've told you down line. And we told you that they're going to be willing to apply pressure. They said that not all nations have oligarchs at the top. But I think if it's not the oligarchs, it's just the other people who hold a power within the nation, whether it be the military generals. I think we can also apply this analysis. This is not new material, as it's simply an extension of analysis, but it's just same thing, different name. So I think we still have people within these nations who can apply that pressure and force these nations to get change. Let's look at what they told us about getting change. The first thing was this vague concept and notion of social change about how we get these people going to these Western universities and coming back. I think this wasn't really established until about third neg, until we got no chance to really reply to that. But secondly, we think they just simply have no presence to actually claim that this is going to happen. There's been no historical rapport of these nations becoming increasingly socialized. And we told you that they're most of these religious fundamental nations who are not going to be taking kind to the ideas of LGBTQ individuals. The second one was this idea of civilians leveraging. This came out at leaders' reply, which was way too late. And we we just simply believe that civilians are going to struggle to leverage their economic capability insofar as that what happens in this debate is that they lose their income and it comes substantially harder. The final thing is on isolationism. This isn't our worst case, and it's just simply now that they invest more into their local economy. I think it was ridiculous their attack to say that there's no money to simply invest anyway. We believe that there probably is some assets that they can begin to invest just to reduce this chance of stability causing. So I think we're here on actually empowering these people, and we only have to empower them marginally in this debate. Next, let's talk about the broader economic outcomes. But I think simply on the fact that they concede that we don't really have a moral duty as much towards these people in this developing nations. I think both teams agree on it. It isn't that much important in this debate, but I think we can extend margins here on 3 reasons. Firstly, we told you about domestic investment, increase small businesses within nations as they're no longer being outcompeted by other nations. We told you this was good as they're no longer reliant and there's instability within trade. We also told you about how they can engage with other trade partners and fill these voids and the economic burdens that occur. And then thirdly, we told you that they can just simply increase production to fill these critical shortages. We heard very little engagement with this material. I think all in all, most of the stands, we get long-term economic stability within these liberal nations. We lift these people out of the abject suffering and poverty, and we don't rely on their own hard work and them pulling up their bootstraps to get success. We enforce the success onto them.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom, for a great reply, and thanks everybody for a great debate. I'm not too sure, are the judges staying in this breakout room and we're leaving, or what's